Daphne.
God, I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
I
No,
do some things, but I don't do technology.
I
So
have been there. I've been there. I've been that girl tapping and, scrolling and trying to work it out. It's all good. We're here. We're here. And, let's take a breath. I
yes,
need that.
mm, definitely
I've had
a
one of those
few,
days.
right? One of those years.
Yeah, that's right. But hey, Daphne, thank you for
Thank
taking
you
the time tonight.
for
Yeah, 'cause,
doing this.
we're
Truly.
it's like it's always a deep dive, these conversations. I always like, kind of pre-warn people logging on, like we're gonna get into it tonight. These are gonna be some uncomfortable
Yeah.
conversations for some people, but they're important ones right now. And I explained to people that have logged on the meaning of down the rabbit hole, as Atafe and I have, come up with this name.
Yeah.
But it is this nonsensical, bizarre situation we find ourselves in right now, and it's so hard to extricate ourselves from this
Mhm.
ingrained um, sort of, yeah, hierarchy that has developed over time, not only in the music industry but throughout the world. And our last guest, Dawn, brought up some really amazing points about ownership and about the importance of really knowing your worth in this industry and knowing where you come from, your identity, and therefore knowing how to demand a better way forward when it comes to contracts, when it comes to
Yes.
all kinds of things.
Hmm.
And it's really perfect that you're joining us now, because the field that you work in is so relevant to this conversation. And I'm not going to paraphrase all your amazing achievements, but it would be so wonderful if you could just give a little rundown of, what it is you do, what it is you spend your days doing, what you've spent your life researching, just so everyone understands, who we're sitting here with tonight.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Kimbra, for having me, and um, for being in conversation with me. We had you when I couldn't log on, and I could hear you talking, which was great. I know you mentioned to everyone that you visited Yale for the conference that we had on Bowie and Prince back in
Yep.
2017, and that you and Amir were in this incredible conversation. It was so rich. It was so personal, but also so thoughtful and so historically situated about the meaningfulness of both of those artists' repertoires. So you're the kind of artist that I just so value because you think so much, so long and hard about these issues. So thank you for having me. Um, and what can I say? What was I doing today? I was teaching my class in protest music and the Black radical tradition here at Yale. I'm a professor of African American Studies, American Studies, women's gender and sexuality studies, and music here at Yale. Before I taught at Yale, I taught in the English department, African American Studies at Princeton, and before that, UC San Diego in literature. So, I'm a humanities scholar. I'm also a popular music studies critic, and I've written for various press outlets, the New York Times, The Nation, um, The Guardian. I'm working on a piece for The Guardian on blackness and Radiohead, which is very dear to my heart. So that's what's on my desk right now. And I just finished a book called Liner Notes for the Revolution: The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound, which is a history of music criticism through the vision and labor and artistry of Black women musicians and Black women music critics. So trying to kind of think about the ways that our knowledge of pop music history has been shaped by a teeny tiny little cluster of dudes across a long period of time, and how we can kind of rethink that history if we just reposition ourselves and reattune ourselves to a different set of thinkers and artists. So that's some of what I
Yeah.
do. That's my jam. And I'm again,
Yeah.
I'm honored and thrilled to be here with you.
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of a position of a student tonight, and it's not usually a word that I would use in these sorts of conversations, because I don't think that's it's not really the right way to approach it. As a white person, I would hope that all of us are doing our own work individually to learn about America's history, to learn about our place in it as people of privilege. So, you know, being approaching conversations with your Black friends as a student all the time can be very exhausting for your Black friends, and I understand that. Now, it's a little different with you because I know you are a professor. This is what you do for work, and so I am going to hopefully, you know, just sensitively step into that place of being more of a learner tonight, because I think in our conversations we've talked about the importance of musicians, you know, of all races, knowing where the genres, especially of blues and funk and soul and R&B and hip hop, you know, where they really come from, and the importance of understanding your history. And it's not something that would sort of come to mind when you're getting into the music industry. You're getting a SoundCloud going and you're getting, you know, your beats ready for. It's not the first thing you think of as like, let me be a great historian on the greats, but in many ways it's how we can really have power in this industry the more that we know about its origins. And I would love you to talk a little bit about A, what makes you so passionate about that, and B, why that is so important for artists. I think, you know, especially white artists, because we have been able to walk through the world not knowing so much, and we have the power to make change now.
Yes.
What is the first of all, what's the importance of it? That's a pretty obvious question, but I'm sure you can speak to it further. And also, where to start? You know, like where to start?
Yeah, where to start? Where does it start?
Yes.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think if you start with captivity, right? If you start with people who were stolen and were defined as commodities, who were bought and sold, that is a painful, wretched history. But I think it also should hopefully encourage us to really hold the music that we love even more dearly and closely to our hearts, because it's a miracle, right? It's a miracle.
It is.
It's a miracle, right? That people were brought over as human cargo, right?
Yes. Yep.
And found a way to survive it. And part of their survival, you know, really did involve being able to create art, right? That could make meaning out of their wretched condition, out of their subjugation, right?
Yes.
So it meant, you know, having to face the fact that it was illegal to learn to read and write, right? It was impossible to maintain a family, right? It was impossible to call yourself, you know, 100% human, right? According to the legislative and juridical guidelines of this country. And so what's the recourse? What's the recourse? The recourse is performance. The recourse is music. The recourse is, you know, being able to make sounds that could be coded language, as the great Saul Williams, one of my favorite slam poets, who's also a great black rock musician, has this epic jam, you know, coded language from the turn of this past century, right? So you have this tradition that starts with, you know, forbidden expression, right? That's powerful. That's dangerous. That's revolutionary, right?
Yes.
And then it evolves across time. It takes on all of these different forms, right? From spirituals to ragtime to jazz and the blues. These genealogies are all crisscrossing each other, right? To rock and roll, R&B, gospel, right? To the contemporary landscape, in which you have this proliferation of all of these different popular music forms. The majority of them coming from the blood, sweat, and tears of people who were never meant to survive in this country. So if you have that history in your head, then maybe you're stopping to think, you know, whatever I love about these beats, there is this long life to them, right? Yeah. That delivered them to me and, you know, made it possible, you know, for us to, you know, have access to these culturally expressive forms.
Yes.
It's incredibly powerful. I think it's amazing. And
you're right. It's a miracle that
it's a
we
miracle.
have this music that traces back through this incredible,
Totally.
Terrifying journey, really, of the human. Yeah.
Which is why, as someone who's also an English professor, it drives me crazy when people talk about the Jazz Age and Gatsby, and they don't remember that jazz itself, the term was a racist term that was used. It was kind of a pejorative term for semen. Like, this is the kind of music that will make you sexually ecstatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's problematic for people who were commodities and deemed as breeders. And, so you have this music that has this term that was not the term that the people who made the music, that they gave to the music at all. But that music is a repository of the history of the people, right? It's, in jazz's case, it comes from, people on the move, people who were not only forced to migrate, across the terrible voyage of the Middle Passage, but then, fleeing the South from white supremacy and from, Jim Crow disenfranchisement and poverty, right? And out of all of that disorientation and movement came this music that was about playing through the changes, right? It was about trying to sustain and imagine new ways of resituating oneself in the world. That's the beauty of improvisation.
Yeah.
And that is a key and core principle of Black performance cultures and Black sound cultures is change, right? Mm-hmm. It's the ability to be able to constantly reinvent yourself. When you're told, no, you need to stay here, and you are this thing. And by the way, we're going to perform this thing that we think you are, and we'll call it blackface, right?
Yes.
So this is incredible music, right?
Yes, it is. Yes. Yes. And I mean, that's so fascinating, because I feel like that insight you just gave around the term jazz, I don't feel like that's widely known at all, that was a term that was used. Yeah, there's just so much.
Shiz is what it was originally called. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. What's one, as a person who is engaging in these genres of music and wanting to pay respect to the forefathers of these musical genres, where do you think people should begin? Because you just wrote an amazing article on, say, Mamie Smith, who you coin as the mother of the blues, really, right?
I mean, technically, Ma Rainey, who was like kicking it on the tent show circuit in the early 1900s, is called the mother of the blues.
Okay.
But Mamie Smith is the first sister to be permitted, I shouldn't even put scare quotes, to be permitted by the recording industry,
right,
to record, to make a record. First African-American woman to do that.
Yeah. So I think, that study, we talked about this on our last phone call. For me, that study came from being an avid listener, so getting so deeply acquainted with the discographies of Prince, of Stevie Wonder, of Sarah, going back to Billie Holiday, going into the discographies of my favorites. But I think because there's such a pervading sense of is that the word, erasure? Erasure? Yes, of the history. I don't think it's easily accessible for people to really know these origins. And I'd love to know from you. Of course, you can go and do a degree at a university, but what we're trying to do here, right, is down the rabbit hole, is really trying to move people off of the sidelines of these conversations and trying to become active and engaged, which is always the hardest thing, right? Because complacency is the easiest thing in the world, especially if you're privileged in this country. So where, are there sort of, and this might be too specific, but, are there books, are there places, are there artists to start with that are really great for leading you in that journey?
Oh my goodness. There's so many points of entry, right?
Yeah.
There are clusters of especially Black feminist scholars who've written so beautifully about the history of the blues long before I did.
Yeah.
So the great Angela Davis, who is also our Black feminist, Black power icon of the past half century, wrote a book on Black women's blues musicking, as we sometimes call it, and the different ways we can understand the blues as being central to Black women's lives. My colleague, the great Hazel Carby, wrote an article called "It Just Bees That Way," that was also about kind of thinking about Black women using the blues as a way to articulate, their sexual politics, in the wake of emancipation, after they'd been, they didn't have control of their bodies, right? And so this music became the revolutionary music. And we can think about Cardi and Megan and ask all sorts of questions about where they fit into this genealogy. But this kind of reclamation of public sexuality was, revolutionary in a variety of ways. And Professor Carby wrote about that many years ago. Yeah.
And it seems like as you investigate the greats from political commentary, social commentary of the times, you're going to get music playing into it because it's always central to political movements, and to spirituality, the religious movements. So I think that's really helpful advice there, to just go into the great writers like Angela Davis and see where music enters into their commentary.
True. The music is also, as we were talking about, right? The music is history itself too, right? For people who didn't have, they didn't have libraries of Congress that, were made for them to store their history. They didn't have the Smithsonian until a few years ago, right? So if you don't have these kind of major institutions that can preserve your past, right? Music was central to historical memory of African Americans. So, some of the artists who are really self-conscious of that history, we have quite a few now in this present moment. But I would say going back, like people like Nina Simone, the High Priestess of Soul, was always thinking about history in her music. And so a song like For Women is about the history of, racial and gender subjugation that we've been talking about. An incredible song that gives you, 300 years of history, in the course of 4 minutes. The folk singer Odetta, who, went back and actually went into the archive in order to find the songs of captives and to sing them again during the civil rights movement, right?
Wow.
So, I think that's a project that could be taken up again right now. I'd love to see Janelle and Solange and The Weeknd and Frank Ocean and, right? All of these kinds of, all of our artists that are adjacent to you, who are, thinking very seriously about Blackness and the historical past and their relationship to the past. So, and then of course, it's the most written about pop text of the past decade, if not longer. But Lemonade is it's a history book, and in the first 48 hours, it was, she's coming for Jigga, and there were all sorts of scholars going, I don't think this is just about Jay-Z. I think this is about the long history of, Black women's marginalization and disenfranchisement in American culture. It's also about New Orleans as the port city that encompasses all of that history, right? Of slavery, of emancipation, but also all of this hybrid cultural music of which, Black folks were centrally involved at the center of in New Orleans, right? But they were pulling all of these different, circumatlantic forms. So, Lemonade has all of that going on.
It's so true. We forget that these are history lessons in these, in this current pop. We're getting so much amazing, gritty, So when you want to engage, it's actually interesting to think you don't have to look too far for artists who are putting that at the forefront of their work. It's just about kind of getting out of that mindset of like, oh, it's probably about Jay-Z, and being like, no, let's, like,
no, I just think, what do you mean? And that work has just that's been incredible because, as you were saying, Kimbra, talking about being a student, I think I've never seen in my time as a scholar the amount of people who did take to studying Lemonade. There's a really great podcast called Dissect that has, a week by week analysis of Lemonade. And, we usually, are doing that in the history of rock and roll. It's always about, and no shade because I actually like him, but it's about Dylan and about, all of the different ways we understand Dylan's symbolism and his, his literary greatness. I mean, he won a Nobel Prize, as did Toni Morrison, but, so that's,
right.
That's great, right? But there are all of these different artists who are doing this kind of work that deserve that kind of close historical and socio-political analysis.
So let's jump into that. This, so much of what we want to talk about here is whiteness as the construct that it's become. And, we dismantle white supremacy when we first recognize it early on and, converse about it, understand it. So can you, as a historian, as a, prestigious woman you are, explain for me.
Oh, please.
Please.
I'm going to go watch Lovecraft Country and eat junk food and have some sangria in a little bit, but sure, prestigious. Yeah, let's go with that.
Take it and run with it.
Okay.
Hear me out. So where does this start to take on a whiting out? Where does this start to, how does white supremacy in your study of this stuff really start to erase the stories, and who are the people really responsible for this? Is it happening at an executive level all the time, or is it happening from demand? Like, how can we better understand? I'm trying to get away from that vague sort of like, oh well, white supremacy, it took over and it just ends there. It's like, no, how did this happen? How does this happen, and how can we prevent it from happening for our next generation?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so a couple of different ways to think about this. One, the captivity narrative that we've already discussed is important. I like to use, I don't like to use any of these terms, but captivity, I think, is more palpable for people to kind of embrace at this point as like a real thing that happened. We've become slavery's turned into an abstraction for people. I mean, it's a term we need to keep using, but if you think of people as being held captive against their will, you get to, the root of it, right?
Really helpful, I mean, like you said, it's awful, but it's helpful in the sense of like reclaiming a word that everyone knows what that feels like. To be,
to be held captive. Yes. So people who are held captive, they're turned into commodities, right, for the wealth of this country. They're turned into laborers who also produce the wealth of the country. By the time you get to the late 19th century, the 1890s, well, actually, no, let's go back. By the time you get to the antebellum period, 1830s to 1860s, leading up to the Civil War, the major form of entertainment, the most popular form of entertainment in this country is blackface minstrelsy. And this is a form in which you have, and it's very important to keep in mind who these people were, right? It's not all white people who are performing in blackface, although most of white American culture, especially middle class, is enjoying it and consuming it. But the people performing it are initially white dudes. And they are white dudes who are working class, and they are white dudes who are immigrants, largely from places like Ireland and Eastern Europe, Jewish communities and populations, right? Those folks were not necessarily considered white in the 19th century. And there are many scholars who've written about this. Matthew Fry Jacobson, who we'll say is my partner, but that is not the point, because that book won many awards years and years ago.
That's right.
And there are tons and tons of other. David Roediger wrote about this many years ago. Blackface, white noise. I can't remember from Berkeley. Okay. But there's a whole set of thinkers who are making this claim that you have to understand that blackface was used as a social tool for people who were deep in the margins to say, hey, that's not me. I'm actually going to make myself white by performing the not me. Okay. So this becomes the important prehistory to the recording industry, because then if you have a people who are deemed as commodities or as things, as the entities that can be used for profit and other purposes, then you get to control the whole game, right? And that leads to the birth of the recording industry and identifying how and when and in which way Black people are going to sound, on record, right? Yeah. And that's why, and you and I have talked about this, and I've written about this, many other great scholars, Elijah Wald, lots of other people have written about this, originally in popular music culture, it was white people who got to record the blues, this music that they overheard,
right,
but not black people, right?
Right. Yep.
And the evolution of that history then leads to white people who are not only controlling the recording industry, but they're in control of knowledge production about the music itself. And by that I mean fancy term for who gets to be the critics and the journalists who write about what they think about the music, right? It's
Wow.
gonna be dudes again, and they're gonna be white, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you have folks who are controlling cultural institutions like the recording industry, the fourth estate, journalism, and all aspects of cultural media as it evolves across the modern century, as it was called, the 20th century.
Yep.
And that gets you to a place like one of my obsessions, Rolling Stone magazine,
Yep.
the late 60s, birthed at my alma mater, UC Berkeley, by Jan Wenner, Ralph Gleason, some other folk. And, you know, a conduit for being able to define taste, right?
Yes.
Specifically as it relates to rock and roll. There was a long history of jazz music criticism, and the scholar John Gennari has written beautifully about that, about the history of jazz critics. Those were dudes too, who were largely white, right? Yeah. Okay. Early in the 60s, you get Leroy Jones, the late great Black arts movement activist, Black nationalist. He changes his name to Amir Baraka. He wrote a book called Blue Ball. So, you know, he was one of those people, along with Albert Murray, along with the novelist Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man, who were dudes as well, but brothers who were trying to claim writing about the music themselves, right? This is important. Like, you know, I just finished this book and people are like, why are you writing about music criticism? I'm like, well, because once you have an institution, right, a set of people telling you what to listen to and what not to listen to, that's also going to, you know, control the flow of capital. It's going to, you know, give you situations in which something like Lemonade doesn't win album of the year because maybe you don't have people who really recognize the depth and the complexity of that music. Wow. You know, you play to what you know. So this is like the most compressed, you know, version of a very long and complicated history.
No, but I'm following you, you know, it is a lot, but it's also really fascinating to hear you talk about just how influential the critics are, even at that, you know, trace it way back to when we had this blackface phenomenon, you know, people writing about music that early on, being white, being men, already sets a precedent for how, like, you know, critics are established. Yeah.
Totally. And then you have, you know, with the recording industry, to go back to that moment in the blues in the 1910s when white folks were recording the blues, you have like these dudes who are running companies and going, well, you know, those black people, I don't know, I've seen these blackface shows and I know me some black people, and I don't think, one, I think they're probably lazy, so they're probably not going to make great records. And, you know, two, I don't think black people are going to buy the music.
They're not going to buy.
They're not going to buy it.
Right.
So why should we make these records by black people when we can just have white people make them? Because white people want things made by white people. This is literally how the first, you know, 20, 30 years of the early pioneering recording industry, you know, evolved, which is not to say there were African-American opera singers who were making records in the 1910s. There were vaudevillians like the great Burt Williams, who was an African-American blackface performer, because yes, African-Americans were asked to black up as well to perform the version of blackness that white people had defined for them. So he actually recorded the first blues record by an African-American. But, you know, for the most part, they were like, oh, you know, I think that popular music, that low down music from the juke joints, that blues stuff, we don't want anybody but white people to do that. You know? It's insane. It's so central to my scholarship, but I still, like, you know, find it absolutely, you know, so hard to wrap my brain around. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
You use a term called knowledge production, Daphne, and you've
Yeah.
used it a couple of times with me, but I really want people to understand talk to me about what you mean when you say that.
Yeah. So, you know, the university, the institution of the university in general is the space in which research about, wide range of subjects that constitute our modern life.
Sorry, my
Yeah, no problem.
Netflix just turned on. Keep going. Yep.
Hey, that's great. Yeah.
Yep. It's the dog. It was the dog.
The
Yep.
dog. I was afraid my dog was going to come in. He usually
It's
comes
okay.
out.
It's okay. Knowledge production.
Knowledge production. So it's just a fancy way of saying the people who are in control of being able to define what we know and what we think we know, right? And so, it makes it sound a little bit suspicious. I don't want it to sound that way, but we do have to question who's been in control of the people producing knowledge, that that supports and sustains, institutional power. And how do people who are in the margins produce their own, knowledge about who they are when other people are trying to tell them who they are? I just today in class was teaching. Today's class is about the great Zora Neale Hurston, who was this legendary Harlem Renaissance writer. Her most famous work is a novel called Their Eyes Were Watching God. Oprah did a production of it that Halle Berry starred in on television probably about 10, 15 years ago. The great Alice Walker, herself a Black feminist novelist, rediscovered Zora Neale Hurston in the 1970s because Zora Neale Hurston wrote this amazing novel and then, fell into obscurity, fell in hard times, and then was reclaimed in the 70s and 80s as an icon of like early Black feminist writing. She's a complicated and amazing person. She's also a genius. She was an anthropologist. She was a sister, went to Barnard and Columbia, and then she wanted to go back to Edenville, her home in Florida, all Black town, first all Black incorporated town in the United States. She wanted to go back there as an anthropologist, and she wanted to document the folk culture of, Black working class rural people where she came from. Yep. Because she said the universities, and she was right, didn't care about these people. They weren't writing about them in a way that took seriously their art, their modes of cultural expression, the music that they were making. So she went down to Edenville in the late 1930s during the Great Depression, right? And this is in a moment as we think about our own crisis right now when the government actually stepped up, FDR's government, to provide funds to artists to go into communities around the country in the United States and document art, right? To make art. They wanted to give work to artists. We think about that all the time right now because it was the Depression. And they also wanted to kind of take a moment that was so precarious in history and try to document it. And so Zora Neale Hurston said, let me go back home because people don't take my life and my world seriously, and I want to create knowledge about this community. And she did, and she made all these recordings. You can find them online. Zora Neale Hurston's recordings on the Smithsonian website where she's singing the songs of the folk. Wow. And, people believed if she hadn't done that, we wouldn't have access to all of these just songs that were made by, everyday geniuses in their own communities. So that's what I mean by knowledge production.
Yeah, no, that's super fascinating. And I mean, let's kind of jump to present day for a bit. Mm-hmm. And, look at how we still see this stuff play out now. It's obviously still, I mean, we can talk about even the genre sort of urban and the way that that's used to keep music sort of off to the side and
right.
Thoughts on that, because when we talk about changes in the music industry, there has been a lot of talk about eliminating that term altogether. I'd love to think about that, and also just like how can we get better at recognizing when that's still playing out in current methods of the way that we consume knowledge or music criticism.
Well, Kimbra, let's go to our favorite or one of our shared favorite artists, Prince,
Yeah.
David Bowie too, who very famously said, um, when he was signed to Warner Brothers in the late 70s, "Don't make me a black artist."
That's
And
right.
people
Yeah.
always were like, "Oh no, he didn't like blackness." By the way, anyone who read the Times review of the new Sign of the Times package, I think it was Ron Tannenbaum, I think, great piece, but he did allude to him. Oh no, it was for a profile of Lenny, and he
Oh,
alluded to Prince as biracial, and I'm like, no, that was in Purple Rain. Prince was actually had two African American parents, but whatever. So anybody read that, like, I can't believe.
wow.
I
Interesting.
know he went for the mythology, but
Yeah.
you know. Um, at any rate, Prince made that comment, and people thought it was a declaration of self-loathing in some ways. But actually, what he was suggesting was, you know, you don't get to define what blackness is, right?
Hmm.
My blackness is so capacious, so wide, right? It can
Multifaceted.
encompass so many, multifaceted, so
Mm-hmm.
many sounds, right? I am all of the things, right? So you don't get to call me that according to the terms defined by the recording industry. So we have to be suspicious of, based on the history that you and I have been talking about, Kimbra, any kind of categories that are coming from institutions that have been hostile to, you know, Black cultural life in the past. I'm not sure what to do with urban because, you know, there is a whole history of African Americans not only seeking refuge in cities when, you know, the threat of white supremacist violence in the South was overwhelming in rural areas, but it was everywhere, right? So cities were important to, like, the Harlem
Right.
Nights, right? To, you know, the art ensemble of Chicago, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Cities are important, but to limit our definitions of blackness to urban, which has all sorts of, you know, anti-black um, adjacent ideas attached to it, you know, that
Mm.
which is based on, you know, structural inequality, right? The fact that, you know, when African Americans moved to cities, and Richard Wright has a photographic, the late iconic novelist Richard Wright, like Ralph Ellison, has
Yeah.
a,
Yeah.
you know, a collection of photographs that's about, you know, just the absolute squalor that Black folks were forced to live in when they came to cities, right? And we know about redlining, you know, we know about all of the ways that urban spaces were, you know, controlled and used as forms of oppression for Black people.
Yes.
So it's a complicated term, but, you know, as we've been talking about all night, Black folks survived that too. At the same
Mm.
time, we know that, you know, there's, Zora Neale Hurston would say, but there is a Black life that's outside of the urban. So, you know, should we limit it to that? And are we really talking about Black artists? You know, do we want to have categories that are racialized? That doesn't seem quite right. Why can't we open up, you know, the ways that we define what music is and what genres are altogether? Would seem to be a good way of doing this.
Of course, and I'm glad that the conversation is, you know, opening up. That seems like a good, you know, move ahead. But
Yeah.
it's so interesting how um, I think so many folk may not even be aware about what is, and myself included, I'll say,
Mm-hmm.
about what is, you know, even offensive in the first place about these terms. So easy to be ignorant and kind of,
Sure.
and taking that time to understand. I mean, for example, one of our guests, Aaron Bird, you know,
Yes,
very
the great Aaron Bird. Mm-hmm.
explained how even the simplest terms like white lies that we say, you know,
Sure.
the one lie that we are accepting,
Right.
you know, or kind of
Sure.
for, and
Right.
just
Or white trash, which is
right,
problematic for all sorts of reasons. First of all, it's a class insult, but it's also racialized because the suggestion is that anything that's white presumably is not something is something pristine, but to modify it by using trash, you're calling attention to,
wow.
you know, some kind of distinction that you want to make about whiteness. I hope that made sense.
No, it really does. It
Yeah.
really does. I think, you know, I want to just segue into one of the questions that we ask all of
Sure.
our guests is, you know, from your perspective, with all of these things in mind, what do you wish that white folk were talking about more amongst each other? Because, of course, it's so important to elevate the Black experience and to understand it and to be, well educated in it, which I think is the work now for folk to really, know the history. God, it's taken far too long, hasn't it? It sort of seems so awful to talk about it as such a sort of fresh idea, so forgive that. But, what would be your hope, that there was more conversation around? I'm sure there's many things, but understand what's at the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I also want to be careful not to monolithicize all white people, right? In the ways that we were just like talking about, like, based upon, region and internationalism and
Sure.
class and, all genders. And
Yep.
so it's complicated. But I do think, the thing that I say in my book is, I mean, it's very much what this conversation has been. It's, to these blues nerds that I write a lot about who just, are big blues record collectors. You really, I know you love this music so much, and you've gone out and you've dug around and found these old records. And have you ever thought, with all the scratches on those records, like who played them before you? Like, who were the people who needed this music, who enjoyed it, who cared for it, and why did they need it? And I think the most basic questions like that can then lead you, as you would say, the name of this wonderful thing you're doing, down a rabbit hole, a good rabbit hole, right? To ask these questions about, who has controlled the music and who's made the music, and why have all of these different categories of people, operated in the way that they did? What were the historical circumstances that led us to this place? The late great Black queer feminist poet and scholar June Jordan has an epic anti-rape poem, and in it, it's called A Poem About My Rights, and in it she has a refrain that says, "Who in the hell set things up this way?" It's just like the greatest line. She was so fearless. And I do think that is the fundamental question that we all should be asking, right? To not accept the structures that we've been born into without asking who built this.
Oh, Daphne, that's so powerful. Who in the hell made it this way? I mean, what a great sort of mantra for everyone right now in this moment. I think that's deconstructing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's the great June Jordan, who in the hell set things up this way, Yeah.
When it comes to real change in the music industry, because this is the bridge I'm trying to make in my head, is like, we can know the history, we can understand and respect it. And how a musician like me who cares about doing anti-racist work to, move forward in this area with the influence I have, we see it actually take form in sort of, I'm thinking, let's think board meetings at record labels, when discussions get made about the kinds of they're going to, how does this history, what could it do if people were better students of especially Black music to re-inform the way forward? It makes me think of like reparations, of course, going through old contracts and looking where education has taken place.
That's great.
Record industry side. Then there's also the artist side. What does it mean for new artists upcoming who, instead of walking into it as a young 17-year-old with no real idea what their worth is, they walk knowing, no, I know where my music comes from. I know where the story of the heritage. How does that shift, the tangible infrastructure of, you know what I mean? I'm trying to get to the place. How does this now?
I know.
If we were to have a brainstorm.
Right. I mean, oh my God. Well, I mean, we've been seeing these institutions trying to think about actual change through who are the decision makers, right? So that's a huge thing.
Yeah.
And then I think there are like, my dreams, if I had all the money in the world, and my weird vision is to be able to, to bring back music education in school, since that's super important, right? So you would have people coming up who become executives who actually maybe know something about the music of captivity, and about that whole history, and are thinking about that when they're talking to artists about, the kind of music that they want to be able to historically showcase. Maybe it's, having thousands and thousands of critical conversations in communities where you can listen to the music together. I mean, this is something that I actually did do with Jack White and Dean and Scott Blackwood, who are the brothers who run Revenant Records, and Jack's team from Third Man, the legendary rock critic, because I do love him. He's a pioneer, Grail Marcus, Adia Victoria, who's a fantastic contemporary alt blues musician who's in the South. Valerie June came through separately.
Yep.
But with that session that we had, where we were listening to the old, as they were called, race records. They were called race records because they were music. It was music made by African Americans that was deemed to be for African Americans, right? But it was all the blues music, right? Yeah. And it came out of this company called Paramount Records, which weirdly recorded in Grafton, Wisconsin. Which weirdly, because we just have to talk about history in this moment, there was a whole piece in the New York Times last week about racial hate crimes in Grafton, Wisconsin, and the Trump, just a very strong community of Trump voters in Grafton, Wisconsin, who probably don't know this history of African American blues musicians who came into that city and made some of the most important blues recordings of all time. These like James and Blind Lemon Jefferson and Ma Rainey and Ethel Waters. Anyways, and twice we did it at the New York Public Library, and we did it at Yale. And I'm like, God, if we could do this all over the country, like with all sorts of artists, and just listen to the old records. And Jack White, don't sleep on Jack White. Jack White was talking about Ethel Waters, being this this Black feminist, pioneer of the blues and everything. So we were just kind of going back to the old music, the music that is the history that we stand on. Yeah. And figuring out our creative and, in my case, scholarly relationship to it. That would be fantastic. That's just like a mad, fantastic dream.
No, I mean, look, when we were talking with Dawn on the last conversation, ideas came up around conferences, that were built to equip young artists by other artists for the music industry, rather than expecting the people at the top to change when this is ingrained. Get it changing from the people coming into it, and
my colleague, he's a superstar Black Studies scholar, one of the godfathers of the modern field of African American studies, Henry Louis Gates, probably the most famous Black Studies professor in the world, and he is chair of FM at African American Studies at Harvard. And he has a show on PBS called Finding Your Roots. It's one of the DNA shows, right? Oh. And so he has all his team go in and find out Seth Meyers' entire genealogy, or Sarah Silverman. Amir has done it, right, and found out incredible things about his genealogy because he's Amir, right? But I'm just thinking right now, I'm like, God, wouldn't it be amazing if we could do that with artists, with musicians, having a whole musical genealogy presented to them, kind of their DNA, right? Their musical DNA, and them having to flip through the book, and Gates is pointing out here are all the artists that made it possible for you to make this sound. I would want Donald Glover to do that. That would be amazing, right? Here are all it'd just be cool. It'd be great. And it'd be educational and informative and inspiring for the artists, right? To imagine oh, this is how I got here. This jam that I thought, I just heard from, I grew up listening to X, Y, and Z, but that person grew up listening to that person. Wow. Grew up listening to that person. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, I feel would love. And don't think that that's some fantastical dream. I mean, this is the time. We have all this time on our hands to think of ideas like this. And don't worry,
it'd be great. Well, I'm going to pitch it to Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates. I see him in a while. And
seriously, just that could be a Netflix series, for real.
Seriously, right? It'd be so
Yeah. Let me jump real quick because we're gonna have to wrap up soon, and I
Okay.
really do. This is like a really big topic to bring up out of nowhere, but you mentioned some white artists like Jack White and people
Mm-hmm.
that are doing some really great work to make sure that
Yes.
they honor the forefathers of where they've come from, and
Yes.
that's like a really crucial part of being a white accomplice. And
Yeah.
that's a big
Yeah.
part of the conversation is what can we do to go
Right.
beyond allyship, like allyship
Mm.
minimum. What's an
Wow.
yeah?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I think I I just think you all are the amazing creatives, and I think your art itself will say something, right? It shouldn't be the only thing, but it's certainly another place to go, right? To create art that actually is very, very mindful of everything that we've talked about, and handles that history with care. And then there's the practical stuff of mentorship, and being able to identify artists who from marginalized publics who don't have access to the industry in the same way. I mean, maybe, well, I shouldn't say it this way, but I still watch Empire. I don't know who else does it. And in the final season, which now kind of ended, isn't quite done, they had one of their subplots was about a trans artist who is given another chance and had a very difficult history with the characters on the show. And it's just an example of like these forms of, we call it in academia, social intimacies that actually add up to the quality of our lives. Yeah. And so I think mentoring is incredibly important to transforming the climate, right, of the industry. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Yeah. And I'd say Dawn also mentioned, just the important, like seeing interracial seeing
Yes.
collaboration across cultures, that idea of white folk being able to step back and really give platform to where there has been so much lost in our history. Yeah. And seeing more of that seems really powerful as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man.
I mean, what you're doing right now, this is what
we're
we
trying,
need everybody
right?
to be doing. So.
We're gonna try. And I mean, it's just I'm so wary as well of the tendency toward the performative, which is the record labels have taken that stuff, right. And I know that the risk of that whenever a white person steps in to do this work, but it's just that's why I'm just feel so honored to talk with someone at your level about this stuff, because it can help us to go deeper and move away from just a surface level. I stand with you, to a kind of I work with you. We collaborate.
Very beautiful.
So thank you. I really could talk to you.
Oh my God, no, thank you. It's just so it's so important that your presence in this world and
to go deeper and move away from just a surface level. I stand with you, to a kind of I work with you. We collaborate.
Very beautiful.
So thank you. I really could talk to you.
Oh my God, no, thank you. It's just so it's so important that your presence in this world and in the industry and in the culture. We're just so appreciative, of the music and the mindfulness. It's just really great.
Well, I got my work cut out for me. I tell you, from tonight, like, you can see people in the comments just dying to get your book and dying to know more about the resources. So just letting everyone know, Demon Dap, the Instagram handle that's associated with the series, will be hosting all the resources that we've talked about tonight. So Daphne's going to get us a lot of these titles, get us a lot of these podcasts, these amazing resources, so we can go beyond words and actually do some of this deep investing in the history. So look out for that, everyone, in the next week. And yeah, Daphne, let's keep up these conversations. And
Kimbra, anytime.
We'll hang soon. And congrats.
Now I know how to log on, so
I'm glad you got there. Yeah. Can you tell everyone the book name one more time so we can
my book. It'll be out in February. It's called Liner Notes for the Revolution, The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound.
Ooh, let's do it. Yes. Definitely. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Kimbra. Thank you so much. All right. Good night. Good night, everybody. Bye.